Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Gregory, Managing Director with Thornton. I lead our work overall for the state of California. I'm just going to be kicking us off this morning and then passing it over to my colleagues, Scott Dalessio and Udghosh Bhambore, who are going to be leading us through the session this morning. So quickly, I just wanted to go over the objectives for our session this morning. We're going to be talking about two main topics. The first is Agile Procurement, but with a particular slant on public sector, and thinking about approaches that are practical and pragmatic for applying Agile principles in a public sector environment. We're also going to be reviewing lessons learned from large modernization projects using Agile techniques, and again, thinking principles that are applicable in a public sector environment, and trying to identify some pitfalls and ways to avoid mistakes on a journey towards Agile transformation. Our agenda is in two parts. In the first part, we're going to talk about Agile Procurement. So to begin with, my colleague Scott Dalessio is going to come up and give a short presentation around some thoughts and approaches to applying Agile Procurement principles in the public sector. And then we're going to have a panel discussion with an esteemed panel. We have Jim Butler, Chief Procurement Officer, DGS, who needs little introduction, I think, to most people in the room. Jim Kammerer, Chief of Acquisition and Contracting Services at OSI. Ben Flores from CDT. And Peter Kelly from Child Welfare Digital Services, who's the Deputy Director there. After that panel session, which we'll have some pre-prepared questions, but we hope to have time to invite questions from the audience as well. Then we'll move into a lessons learned session, and then Udghosh Bhambore is going to be talking through some lessons learned around Agile practices, particularly in larger projects. And then we'll have a second panel. Peter will be staying up front to share some of his war stories with us around that. We also have Karen Johnson, Chief Deputy at DHCS, coming to join us. And then Paul Smith, who's been doing a lot of significant Agile work at the Department of Corrections. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Scott, and we will start our conversation around Agile procurement.
Great, thanks, Graham.
I'm not used to having a mic. My voice actually carries very well without having one. But how's everyone doing today, all right? Great. Thank you so much for joining us. My name's Scott Dalessio. Thank you for the introduction, Graham. I am a senior manager at Thornton. I'm in our federal public sector practice out of Washington, D.C. and Alexandria, Virginia. I flew in yesterday. I've been in federal industry doing management consulting for 19 plus years. In some way, shape, or form, I started working on Agile engagements back in around 2008, 2009. My experience, I am not a developer. I will say that right now. I'm a functional IT guy, so my experience is in Agile project management. I have served as a Scrum Master, have served as a product owner. I am an Agile coach. And also I'm involved in implementing scaled Agile framework. I'm currently supporting the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. They are one of our largest Agile clients. We're actually delivering Agile services across the entire SDLC. And so that's great and all, but I know all of you are here today to talk a little bit about Agile procurement. The focus in the industry for a long time has been on, or for those folks that have been involved in Agile, have been on the development side of things. And more we're hearing about now we have to understand that we have development operations that are going to support the Agile processes, because if that becomes the bottleneck, well then we can't really truly support and deploy what is being developed through our Agile development services and deploy into releases or production. The other component is the front end of the process, and that's with Agile procurement. So today we're going to talk about some strategies around how to do Agile procurement. I'll preface this by saying that we're not telling you this is what you shall do or what you should do. That's just not how we operate. These are just some suggestions. It's what we view and we are recommending to some of the folks that we consult with in industry about these are some of the strategies that you should implement. So please don't take this away as gospel, but just some food for thought, and hopefully it will generate some good conversation. So, Agile procurement. So there's this big tree right here. This is not unlike a large tree I have in my yard at my house. It's a key part of my landscape in my house. It's big. It's been growing for years. Roots are actually starting to get underneath my patio, which is causing some problems. So deep-rooted. It's intertwined with other trees in my yard. It's expensive, right? So if something were to happen to the tree, it would fall over, or as branches fall down, it may do damage to my property, and to take it out might be doing some more damage to my yard. So there you go, hard to remove. It's a lot like your legacy systems at your organizations. So these are the same challenges that drive what we refer to as our procurement risks. Okay? So what are some of the root causes, to keep with the IT tree strategy here? But anyways, so pun intended. Large IT modernization procurements often become risky, costly, and unproductive mistakes. How many of these large IT initiatives have we been involved with over the years where we're overrun our budget, our schedule? So there is a direct correlation when we look in the industry that success of IT programs is tied directly to duration. This was actually done, this information on this chart on the left was actually done from a study that came out of the VA, Veterans Affairs. And as you can see, as you know, there was a 55% acceptance rate or success rate for a project that lasted less than 6 months. As soon as you start increasing the duration, at 9 months, it drops off to 32% and so on and so forth. So duration is a proxy indicator for size, complexity, uncertainty, cost. And that's going to be a common theme, I think, in some of the discussion that we're going to have today, is that as things are bigger, as we plan things out farther out into the future, the less we know about those things. Okay? There's some statistics over on the right. 90% of large IT projects are unsuccessful. 55% deliver less value than predicted. 50% are over budget, behind schedule. 40% fail, then restart or abandoned. 16% may threaten the sponsored company's existence. Okay? Pretty real and pretty scary. So Grant Thornton works with the Professional Services Council, and we do a federal CIO survey every year. And this year, one of the responses we got in that survey was from a federal CIO respondent. There's a history of having large federal or state IT programs where $100 million would not be considered big. And that mindset needs to go away. And then this is kind of reiterating what I mentioned earlier, that large equals difficult to understand, difficult to plan, difficult to estimate, organize, and deliver. I know as an Agile coach, and I might be going off on a tangent here, but as an Agile coach, when I work with my teams, I always tell them when we talk about story sizes and feature sizes and estimating, we talk about people in general are horrible at estimating. If you go to the carnival or the fair and there's a big bowl of jelly beans and someone says, tell me how many jelly beans are in this bowl and you'll win the prize, you win the big elephant, stuffed elephant, you know, it's almost impossible to do that. But if you actually say, hey, look at this bowl has 500 jelly beans in it, and then this bowl has more or less, it's going to be a lot easier. So inherently, people are horrible at estimating, but we're really good at comparison. Okay? So pattern for success. So we talked about trees before. We talked about my yard, and there's a big tree in my yard. There's a theory called strangler pattern. It's from nature, and it's based on vines. I'm not making this up when I say this, but I do actually have a big tree in my yard, and I actually do have a problem with one of the trees in my yard, where this invasive species of English ivy has gone into the tree, has bloomed, and is absolutely taking over the tree, and I'm so fearful that if it kills the tree, I'm going to have to look into my neighbor's yard. So, but to me, that's a little bit of a problem. So, but let's look at it from the flip side. That is a very effective way for that vine to thrive. And so, with strangler pattern, what we're trying to talk about here is how we should be looking at our IT investments and our IT development strategy. So, what we want to do is incrementally create a new system around the edges of the old, letting it grow module at a time until the old system is replaced. For way too long, I think, and my clients are guilty of this as well, is that in the federal market space is that everyone thinks that they have to replace the entire system, that whole Big Bang theory. And that's not necessarily the case. And there's always excuses. Well, we have unions that say we have to be able to deliver this, otherwise they can't do their job. I think the key is that we need to focus on what pieces of functionality will give us the most value that we can implement and then slowly replace that system instead of trying to procure and commit to a $100 million IT development effort and instead breaking it down into significantly smaller pieces. So as you can see here, what we want to be doing is let's look at the strangler pattern and how we do IT development. Maybe each branch on the tree is a different module or a different API or web service. So maybe we replace one at a time. And there's often arguments, well, if I have to build this one new module and I have to integrate it with an API to our existing legacy system, does that cost me more money in the long run? And I don't have an answer to that, to be perfectly candid with you. But there's a lot of people in industry that will argue no, that it's actually more costly to try to do the Big Bang approach. So again, in this you can see the tree. We work on one branch at a time until eventually our new system, or our legacy system, is our new system. Okay? So we want to improve procurement success by using architecture to define smaller, less risky, manageable solution boundaries. So instead of going out and trying to procure that large $100 million IT investment where we define all of those requirements up front, we're suggesting there's a better way of doing it in smaller pieces. So for those of you that are familiar with Agile, this should come as no surprise or shock to you all. But this is the business case for Agile. So the one on the left, the graph on the left, is for waterfall. And it's a big cutover, the Big Bang, right? So as you can see, we don't receive any value until the product is delivered at the very end of the project. But all along, we're spending a lot of money. We're increasing our risk because we don't know what this thing is going to do at the end. And we're getting no or little return on investment during the process. Okay? On the right, you can see because we're incrementally delivering value, as we equate that to working software, you can see that we're delivering value throughout, which means we're receiving return on our investments, and we're hopefully addressing risk significantly throughout the entire process. So this is a strong business case for why a modular approach works. But it's not just enabled by changes to our architecture or delivery approaches. So we need our delivery aligned procurement. Okay? So there are obstacles aligning acquisition processes to support modular delivery. And so and this again comes from our CIO survey, without this alignment, it's difficult to move away from large-scale implementations to modular development and realize the full potential of Agile methods. A couple things I want to point out here is that I'm familiar working, as I mentioned, in our federal practice with federal acquisition regulations. Okay? There is nothing in the FAR that says that you have to define all of your requirements up front. And in fact, there's other things in the FAR and the tech FAR, for those that are familiar with it, that OMB and the White House came out with, I believe in 2009, I think around then, that basically says they want to be able to give procurement officials and procurement staff the ability to procure things in the best way possible as long as it's within the lines of the law. All right, so do what's right, make some changes. So we're not saying that we should be abandoning traditional procurement strategies at all. So I'm not going to drain this slide, but you can see these are the typical, what I view in the federal marketplace as the typical 8 steps. You know, we have to determine our business requirements. We conduct our market research. We develop a sourcing strategy. We have acquisitioning, planning, and strategy development. We then develop a solicitation. We select. We negotiate, and then there's our post-award implementation. Nothing that we might be suggesting in some of our strategy, which we'll be getting to, changes any of this. It's just a different way of potentially looking at each one of these things. So to deliver agile procurement capability, we want to talk about segregating program work within less lengthy, risky modules. Kind of already addressed that. Right? So smaller pieces, and align contracts with vendor core competencies. So basically, let's hire vendors for very specific modules that's fit for purpose. They have that specific skill set. So we want to employ specialists and unhinge program success from the performance of a single vendor and a single contract. Okay? We'll talk a little bit more about this. We're going to incrementally fund, we suggest incrementally funding contracts in alignment with our changing needs, priorities, updated release plans. We want to qualify vendors based on demonstrated hands-on ability to perform in-scope work. We want to separate underperforming vendors and quickly engage alternative service providers with minimal disruption. Again, we're going to cover how to do some of these things. We want to link contract payments to vendor performance and delivered value of working software. And we want to measure performance, motivate improvement, evaluate price reasonableness, and maintain pricing pressure on vendors. Okay. So there are 7 enabling practices or strategies that we feel can help an organization do this. And we're going to go through some of these. And we're going to go into some of them in a little bit more detail in subsequent slides. So the first is to segregate service requirements. So you want to diversify delivery responsibilities to unhinge program success for the performance of a single vendor. I can't tell you, especially in federal, how many times I've seen one large systems integrator basically doing everything. What we're suggesting here is that we have a situation where we actually have a different breakdown. We basically have different categories. We have categories of, we can have a vendor doing program and change management, vendors doing product management, doing product development, and product delivery. So those are 4 categories that we tend to look at. Unfortunately, we're not going to have too much time to get into some of those, but I'm happy to have some additional discussion with you all about that if we have time and questions. So, but the point is to unhinge so that we can not rely on one vendor, but on multiple vendors that have their key skills that they're performing. The second is to use a multi-award indefinite delivery contract vehicle, or an IDV. So what this basically does is it allows us to have an established pool of pre-qualified vendors. For those of you that are familiar with GSA and the 18F organization in federal, what they do is when they're going out and asking for vendors to bid on development efforts, they're asking them to prototype. So what we're saying here is that you can establish a pool of pre-qualified vendors who go through that prototyping effort, and you can have them there. And then that way, you may not issue all of them a task order. Maybe there's different modules. You issue one to each, one module to each of the vendors. Maybe you award 2 of the modules to a vendor. But the simple fact of the matter is then you have a pool of pre-qualified people so that if at some point, unfortunately, if you have to make a change, you have the ability to do so. So we want to use modular architecture. We've talked about this. We want to define smaller, less risky, more manageable products and what those boundaries are. And we want the architecture to be used to drive and segregate that work that I talked about before for those different categories, whether it's product management, project management, and change management, development, or deployment, DevOps. We want to use a streamlined procurement process. So one of the things that folks that we work with in federal talk about is that we have to, and I mentioned this earlier, is that we have to define all of our requirements up front, but that's actually not true. If you've worked to develop a project charter, and in that charter you have a well-written statement of objectives with a mission, vision, and success criteria, that's enough to define the task order scope. And so we're suggesting that you have a task order, you award that task order to one of your vendors in your IDV pool, And then, based on your prototyping that you did, and then what ends up happening is that then you can exercise individual lines on those task orders. And we'll talk about what that looks like in a minute. We want to use release plans to incrementally fund work. A lot of times, for those familiar with Agile, we talk about sprints and stories. The suggestion here is that we're really looking around features and release plans. Those are the bigger pieces. Okay? And so when we initially award our task order, it's around a release planning task. And then we treat the development tasks as optional and subsequent planning tasks as optional. We want to define deliverables as working software. So base contract performance measurement and payment schedules on delivery of high-quality software. We don't want to necessarily focus on, did these people have take minutes? Did they provide us status reports? That's great, but the focus here, and it's not on velocity, and I can go off on a tangent for hours about why velocity is the absolutely worst metric to use to measure the performance of our Agile development teams. It's an arbitrary number. And so it's about delivering value, not points. I'm sorry, I can get very dogmatic about that, so if I came off a little assertive, I apologize. And so I'm having that problem with some of my clients right now. They can't seem to get past that fact, and so and it gets me very frustrated. Anyway, so and then measure performance. So we want to be able to come up with a robust set of metrics that we can put in place so that we can identify and work with our vendors to determine how that they're performing. The first part is during the normal execution within a release, it's not to beat them over the head or as a carrot or a stick, but we want to encourage them for continuous improvement, doing root cause analysis, right? But the other thing is though is that we can then, based on that measured performance, use those measurements to understand at the end of the release, before we negotiate the next release with a particular vendor, apply price pressure, understand what it is that they're capable of, and make negotiations about what they should be doing in the next release. So a key concept here is, as we mentioned before, is to reduce single vendor dependency. So what we've got here is we've got the PMO providing governance, management, and control at the top. We then have a product management team that's doing integration, and basically an integration vendor providing architecture, API harnesses. Each one of those verticals is our module that we're developing. And at the bottom, we want that platform vendor providing deployment pipeline management, so DevOps. So again, we're not beholden to our development teams if we have to decide to make a change. A couple key things to point out here is that look at this as a general contractor building a house. Sometimes we'll oftentimes hire a general contractor, but it's not the general contractor that's doing the plumbing, the electrical, the HVAC. They're hiring specialists to do that. So hire the general contractor to work at the top levels, or a team of general contractors to work at the top levels. Let the people that are fit for purpose to be doing the things in those particular verticals. And then if you happen to have a vendor setback, well, you've delivered something still. You can see in the second column, you've delivered something still, and then you can make a change. Now, I'm not saying change isn't difficult. It always is. Having to make a change and bring in another vendor at any point in the life cycle is going to be challenging. But it's better than working with a vendor who's not performing and having that risk increase all the way to the end. Okay? So what does this kind of look like? So the quick version of this, because we're running a little bit short on time, is that we basically have, let's assume that in this area, each one of these is about 3 months long. And so what ends up happening is we have a situation where we've got our vendor, one of the vendors that we awarded our task order to do planning. So they're going to be doing planning at some point within this period prior to our first release. At this time box, the beginning of our first release, we do what's called a release plan review. We talk to our vendor and say, well, you've worked with us, you've helped us define what exactly we're going to be developing within these features and those aggregate stories that are associated to those features, and we basically define the entire release. Now, we understand that there's going to be change. But at that point, you have like a release plan review. And then it's the opportunity for the vendor to say to the government, yes, we basically negotiate our rates. These are the rates we've already established in our IDV pool. This is the amount of effort that it's going to require to order to do this. So this is what it's going to cost. And can you do it? And if there's an issue at that point, well, you've got a plan in place for that next release. Hopefully your vendor says, yeah, we agree to this. We're going to commit to this. We're a partner with you. We're going to work through it. If something happens and they say no, then you can go back to your IDV pool and say, hey, we've already got all these features and these stories defined. Next up. And so what ends up happening is, let's assume that they say, yes, we've committed to that. We then exercise the development line on our task order. So they're now doing the development, and throughout that entire development, we're capturing metrics on the team. At the same time, we've also exercised another optional line that's for planning in parallel for release 2. So at some point during release 1, time and materials, we basically have that vendor team working with the product owner team, doing product management, and then defining what the features and the stories are going to be for the following release. Now again, same thing happens. They deliver what it is that they deliver at the end of release 1. If you're happy with them, great. And if you are, then you can talk about and commit using a release plan review and then commit to the following, and the cycle keeps going over and over again. Now, if you were to decide that you needed to terminate, terminate's the wrong word. If you needed to not exercise the option on that task order, then you can award it. Now, there might be a small lag or delay in between where the two releases are, but it's minimal because you have that pool ready in play. So what does that kind of look like? So as I mentioned, this is what a potential procurement strategy or a Word document might look like for this task order under this IDV. Well, on line 1, we have the release 1 planning. It's about 3 months. It's not going to take 3 months. Maybe it will. But, and we put that under time and materials. So at the end of that, we have our release plan review. And if we all agree to the terms, then what we would do is then exercise options 2 and 3. One would be the development from the plan we just developed. That's firm fixed price. And then option 3 would be the planning for release 2. Now the key thing here to point out is that we could suggest that maybe as part of that negotiated IDV award or task order, you have 3 levels of performance. So it's firm fixed price. And you either achieve gold level, which was everything that we agreed to under the release plan, or some percentage of that where it's then silver or bronze based on how you perform. Now, we know that in Agile development, things can change. That's part of it. That's the beauty of it. We accept that change. Change is a fundamental part of Agile. And so we're not saying that if the product owner team wasn't about to change something dramatically in the middle of a release, that could happen, but then they're taking on that risk, not the vendor at that point. And then you may need to renegotiate and talk about that, about how to deal with that. So vendor management, the described approach requires government to move away from one-and-done contracting models. Requires government to frequently and expeditiously issue and award product-based task orders and release-based plans. There's an issue, there's a challenge here. It can overwhelm the contracting office because we're basically looking at doing these things every release, so every 3 months. So some acquisition functions do not have the capacity to prepare high-quality procurement packages quickly like that. But again, if you establish that IDV up front, it's just a task order at that point. And again, we're not looking at these large set of requirements. We're looking at statement of objectives. We're looking at product charters and mission, vision, success criteria. And then some acquisition functions do not have the resources or all skills required to manage multiple concurrent product development vendors. So government should centralize these responsibilities in a vendor management organization comprised of high-performing procurement and contracting staff with deep IT expertise and requisite innovative acquisition skills. And so I know that one of the things that I've been working on the engagements where I'm involved is I've been trying to actually teach Agile fundamentals to procurement staff. We don't expect them to be Agile delivery experts, but we think that it's important, you know, and even with leadership as well, right? If people don't understand the principles and how these things work, how are you going to ask them to own and empower them to make change to this process? And I'm not saying that you aren't doing that yourselves, but I can just tell you that it's kind of an afterthought in many of the things that I'm working with. One last thing to point out is, you know, stakeholder feedback and a product management lifecycle. We actually implement this with many of our projects and our clients. And what this is it's a product management roadmap. So where we let architecture drive what it is. We define the architecture. We let the architecture drive what it is that we're developing. We work with product owners, product management to do product visioning. Do the product planning, so the release plans, disaggregating the features in those release plans into stories, iteration plans. Then helping out with product development and development operations. And then product ideation. We're doing idea crowdsourcing to identify, you know, different ways, and we're helping implement different processes for our government clients to actually solicit or feedback regarding what's being developed, and have everything feedback into each other. And I'm out of time, so it's actually not questions, unfortunately, at this point, but we're going to welcome our panel up.